today's guests.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of a series of 3 National Press Club luncheons dealing with the general election on Saturday week. Next week, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition will address the club, but today we have chosen the subject of energy, which has become one of the key issues in a campaign that seems to have sprung to life this week. We have as our guests Senator John Carrick on my right, Minister for National Development and Energy, Vice President of the Executive Council and Leader of the Government in the Senate. He is also a former General Secretary of the New South Wales branch of the Liberal Party. And Mr Paul Keating, the member for Blaxland, the opposition spokesman on energy matters and the current President of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Labor Party. All elections generate strong feelings, and we're expecting a very lively debate today between Senator Carrick, Mr Keating and our audience. But perhaps I should make the point that while we welcome audience reaction to the comments of our speakers, it should not be taken as representing the view of the National Press Club. We have an extraordinarily diverse membership. The format for today's lunch will be a 10-minute address by each of our guests, followed by questions and a 5-minute summing up at the end. I now invite Senator Carrick, who won the toss, to open the batting.
Mr. Chairman, Paul Keating, ladies and gentlemen, the issue of energy in this election must be an issue concerning supply. Who, in terms of policies, can put forward best the soundest arguments to supply energy to Australia over the immediate months and years ahead, over the decades ahead, in a world which has very grave difficulties with energy. And I want to make 3 main points to start with to put the energy issue into perspective. First of all, that the world itself is consuming energy at twice the rate it is finding it, and therefore a finite hydrocarbon is going to run out in the definite future and is going to be increasingly short in the immediate years ahead. Secondly, I want to remind you, as I don't need to, that the Middle East is very unstable. It is a main source of supply of imports of petrochemicals for the free world, and a very unreliable source over the indefinite future. And thirdly, and most importantly, to say to you that the concept that Australia can be complacent because it is largely self-sufficient is utterly wrong. And I want to destroy that straight away by pointing out that, yes, we are 67% self-sufficient at this moment in energy, but largely because in recent years we've added to our known reserves because our pricing policies have dug a little deeper in more costly wells. But that self-sufficiency will fall in 5 years to 50%, in 10 years to 40%, in 20 years to something like 10%, so that the world, the Middle East, Australia, all face in oil a perilous situation. In Australia, we are luckier than most of the world because we can put in place in substitutes for oil in terms of coal or gas. We can offer to the world in exports, in surpluses, coal and gas and uranium, and we can ourselves find substitutes from our shales, from our biomass, from our agricultural products, from solar energy, from wind power. But we have a situation in which a gap is going to occur very, very rapidly in our supply of petroleum products and the demand for them. Doubly so because as the world needs more and more energy, so they come knocking at our doors for supply. As the world needs energy to combine its minerals, so we will need to build more industries here to combine minerals and energy for export and for job opportunities for Australians. And so the real test is which political party is going to give you the policies in place to give you the energy balance for the years ahead. And if you're going to examine that, let me say to you, you must make 4 tests of any energy policy. You must ask yourself, will that policy in a sense of immediacy and urgency, conserve? Will it save the products, particularly petroleum, but also other energy, because we will be competing in a world in which the world will be using energy in an economic way? Will it conserve, and conserve strongly? Will it convert away from oil to coal or gas or electricity or to solar? Thirdly, will it get exploration? Will it increase exploration so that we can find the very difficult located oil that we've got and it can supplement? And fundamentally, will it get going now, for the lead time of the years ahead, a sufficiency of synthetic fuel industries so that in 5, 6, 8, 10 years we can iron out that fall away and that we can provide synthetics? Now, I want to very quickly examine for you those four. In the month of August of this year, in conservation, we showed a 9% fall in the consumption of the 10 major petroleum products compared with the same month last year. Over the 8 months of this year compared with the previous 8 months, a fall of 5%, a rapid fall. In fact, compared with America, which had started from a higher wastage, our fall and our conservation is even more significant, even more significant. Conservation is working. Conversion, we're moving away from oil to gas to coal to electricity in a very, very big way, in a very big way indeed. For instance, Greenvale in Queensland is going to switch to coal and save something like 150,000 tons of fuel oil in a year, a highly significant amount. The pipelines that we're putting in, the Dalton to Canberra, the Young to Cootamundra to Wagga, the Sydney to Newcastle, the Lithgow Bathurst Orange, hopefully, these pipelines in themselves, within the space of a year or so, are going to start to save something in the order of 4 million barrels of oil. A huge amount, a huge amount. We have put into position pricing policies on LPG for automotive fuels, which will, not only in our say-so, but in the belief of the producers and the distributors, displace 15% of petroleum use in, say, 3 or 4 years' time. 15% of petrol will be displaced by automotive LPG. We have arrangements with the automotive industry manufacturers whereby they will produce in very clearly defined terms more fuel-efficient vehicles, so that an average vehicle consuming 11.2 litres for 100 kilometres at this moment will in 3 years' time drop to 9, in 7 years' time drop to 8. An enormous saving over that period. A saving by 1987 of 12%. 15% for your LPGs, your 12% in your cars, your conservations, your pipelines, all those coming into position. And of course, an impact on exploration. Let me contrast it. 1975, the year before we came to office, only 29 wells dug in Australia, in the whole of Australia. This year, 121. 1975, $150 million spent on exploration and development. This year, $715 million. And exploration now moving further and further ahead as we seek for more gas, for more oil. But fundamentally, and the key thing that we need to do, is to get synthetics in place, to get oil from shale, to get oil from coal, to get ethanol as an extender or methanol, to get solar, to get wind power, all in place. Rundle, of course, is a classic example. Rundle now promises that in 4 years' time on stream will be 20,000 barrels a day. By 8 years' time, 240,000 barrels a day, equivalent to what we're importing at this moment. And so we want not one Rundle, we want 3 or 4 in position over the decade. The key thing is that the circumstances have got to be available now for the Rundles of this world, the Millmerrons of this world, the Latrobe Valleys, to want to come into position, to want to compete in their enormous high cost against OPEC itself. We have taken part with the International Energy Agency in a major attempt to lower the demand for oil in the world so that there would be a glut, a surplus, and thank God for that in this present situation. IEA, with our cooperation, has lowered the demand by 5% and created a temporary glut. We are moving with them to try to get stability in OPEC prices, but the one thing that will put an end to the OPEC tyranny in the world will be when synthetic fuel will come on stream in sufficient quantities to be able to compete with scarce oil and to meet the demand. Now, all the people who are in the synthetic projects are adamant in one thing. They say that their high cost of production is such that they cannot compete unless import parity pricing, the world scarcity price for oil, is in position and remains in position. The risk, the technology, the enormous costs are such they're willing to compete at that. They're not willing to compete otherwise. That's the story, a story of the issue being one of supply. Who is going to supply it? A story of policies now in position, which in fact are working and working well, acknowledged by IEA, acknowledged by the world outside as being successful policies. And indeed, one of the vital things, the mainspring of this thing, is that the pricing policy is the stimulus which conserves, which converts, which explores, which gives you synthetics. Take that policy away, you don't get those things, you don't get energy, you're dependent on a world which can't supply you.
Thank you, Senator Carrick. And now I invite Mr. Paul Keating, who gets the second use of the pitch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I believe in motherhood too. And I don't think there'd be too much that Senator Carrick said. In some respects I disagree with. But I would have liked to have heard that speech 5 years ago, and not today. And Senator Carrick comes here representing the government, and we have a national election on our hands, and therefore it is my duty and my opportunity to look at the government's record and to put the opposition's alternative. And frankly, we're running on the government's record, and the government's record isn't too good, because there just isn't a national energy policy by the government. And I would have been delighted to have seen Senator Carrick or his predecessor commit those thoughts to a government white paper on energy, or a green paper, which the government indicated and proved it was incapable of producing when we saw draft after draft emerging. And after 5 years, all we really have is a high petrol price policy and not much else. The rest is all on the never-never. Now, every party believes in a long-term sustainable indigenous energy economy. That's our policy, and I would believe in the main thread that was the policy of the government, using the right fuels and the right applications. But the first priority to achieve the objective is to have a national energy policy in place, and we've never had such a policy. This country is torn between the dichotomy of state and Commonwealth interests. Our federation is a problem, where you've got certain constitutional prerogatives residing with the states and certain with the Commonwealth, where in energy this country cannot proceed and succeed until those dichotomies are resolved. And there is no instrument of Commonwealth or state policy which allows for those areas of conflict to be resolved where the state's energy needs are satisfied and where the various state benefits and reserves, in particular energies, are married to the general demands of the Commonwealth. No such instrument exists, and the Labor Party would like to see such an instrument exist in a Commonwealth state National Fuel and Energy Commission on the model of the European Commission, not where the Commonwealth's handing down tablets on high to the states with energy policy, but where the states are involved in an integral way in the bureaucracy of a commission dedicated to long-term energy policy, and where it's staffed by people willing to dedicate their lives and their careers to that objective. That's not available in Australia. And then you'd have the Commonwealth departments of the day fulfilling the appropriate role in supporting and putting in place government policy. But you must be able to work this out with the states. That's never happened, and you won't have a decent policy until it does. Now, Senator Carrick talked about other things, about natural gas and other fuels. There's no natural gas policy for Australia. There's no policy on power generation. We see that now at evidence with the aluminium industries, with the state of Victoria short of electrical power. There's no policy on substitution. And more importantly, there's no integration. We must have an integrated policy to look at the fuels. It's not to be an ad hoc policy. It's something which must be coordinated, integrated and worked out in conjunction with the states, with industries and consumers, and it can be done. But a start needs to be made. It should have been made 5 years ago. Now, the central tenet of the government's policy is this question of high petrol prices. And the government, when it first introduced this policy, was earning about $400 million from this tax. It's now $3 billion 3 years later, from $400 million to $3 billion. They rode the tigers back through the 1979 hike in oil prices, and it's now the fastest growing area of Commonwealth receipts. And I don't blame the government for trying to rationalise the policy. Now, the rationalisation is, of course, conservation and exploration. But I put it to you that there was no mandate by the Fraser government in 1977 to raise $3 billion of extra tax anywhere. In fact, the mandate was to the contrary, to reduce tax. You remember the ads about the fistful of dollars. That was the mandate. And instead of that, we've had a tax by stealth levied at every bowser in the country to raise this amount of revenue. And it's all now done in the name of conservation. Well, let me deal with this question of conservation, because this is a central justification the government proposes. The central justification it proposes for its policy. And the Minister has just mentioned about the conservation gains that we've had in the last month. Extrapolated over a year, it's been about 0.7%. I'll concede it may be higher, and you look at it from the 12 months from here back. But the simple thing is this. The simple failure of the government's policy is that Bass Strait supplies 67% of our requirements. It's straining to supply 67%. It will never satisfy our requirements, and it will produce at its maximum for the rest of its natural life. No conservation policy of the government around price will save 1 barrel of Australian oil. And the government says, my colleague Senator Carrick says, under Labor, petrol will dry up at the bowser. In other words, we won't conserve Australian oil. Not 1 barrel of Australian oil will be conserved by the Fraser government. All that's happening with this rapacious tax policy is to conserve modestly imports of oil. We're asking Australians to pay $4 billion, $3 billion in the crude oil levy and $1,000 million in petrol tax to conserve Middle East oil, not Australian oil, from countries which sell petrol themselves for 3 cents a litre. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, who are now in conflict, 3, 4, 5, 6 cents a litre. Ours is in the 30s. And yet the government's asking us to pay $3 billion to the government to conserve 0.7% of the imports coming into Australia from countries which are themselves wasting petrol at 3 and 4 cents a litre, because Bass Strait is running at its maximum. Now, the government admitted, Senator Carrick admitted just 2 weeks ago in the National Times in an article by Stuart Simpson, that the production from Bass Strait has risen at the government's request from 410,000 barrels a day to 440. So the government can't have it both ways. It can't claim conservation, the implication being that we reduce Bass Strait production, and on the other hand say, look how good it is, it's producing at its maximum 440,000 barrels. The truth is, Bass Strait will produce at its maximum until it expires, and nothing the government will do with its high price policy will conserve 1 barrel of Australian oil. And as far as I'm concerned, it removes the central justification for the policy and lays bare the policy clear as a tax policy. Now, he's also mentioned exploration, and I won't have the time probably to go into that. Suffice to say this, 70 holes are being drilled this year. Senator Carrick said 121, that includes development wells, and their development wells can't be looked at in terms of exploration. 70 exploration wells, 3,000 in Canada this year, 60,000 in the United States. Now, what the Labor Party says, there should be enough of this tax. We want a policy of exploration, and both parties agree to pay import parity for new discoveries. That's the policy under which exploration runs, import parity for new discoveries. And yet, the government tries to claim in some way you need import parity for old oil coming out of Bass Strait, discovered 12 years ago to keep exploration going. The only two companies basically that get any money out of the old oil policy are Esso and BHP. Every other company exploring in Australia doesn't produce any oil, therefore it can get nothing out of the present policy. They operate under the promise of import parity for a new discovery. We agree with that. We want to see exploration, but much more than the government have provided to date. Now, a Labor government will freeze the price of Australian oil. We'll say, thus far and no further, on the collection of this tax without mandate, this $3 billion which the government will raise. And we'll freeze the price for 12 months, we'll adjust it subsequently by the consumer price index or import parity, whichever is the lesser. And that would mean, particularly in the climate of high oil prices in the Middle East, that it would go up by the CPI in Australia, which in fact would keep the oil without increase in real terms, at the same price in real terms. And that way Australians have the benefit of having an oil field in their own country, because if Bass Strait is going to be run down at its maximum rate, in other words, if Bass Strait oil is to gurgle out of those fields tomorrow and for the rest of its natural life, it becomes a subjective matter as to what price it so gurgles. That's whether it's for $2 a barrel or $40 a barrel. It's a completely subjective judgment which a government has to make. And this government's decided to make it at the maximum price, the world price, to finance its fetish with the budget deficit. It's a tax policy, not an energy policy, and we'll put an end to it. Now, in terms of exploration, we want to put some of that $4 billion back to direct search for oil and gas, because not $1 of the $4 billion goes back to direct search for oil and gas. We'll put money back through an Australian Hydrocarbon Corporation to lift that 70 holes. So we're out there looking in our own country when the deep water program fails off Exmouth Plateau, that we have something left to fall back on, that we're using energy tax. When we're using energy tax and exploration, the deep water program is failing and it's got about 4 months to run. So what happens when it does, when the deep water vessels leave? We'll be left with about 40 holes a year. So we should put some of that money back. There should be a much more direct approach by the government to exploration, and of course, in that sense, to substitution and to the other matters, which of course we'd all like to refer, but to which time does not permit.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Right, this is where the fun begins. Questions. The first question is from Paul Malone of the Financial Review, I think to Senator Carrick.
Yes, well, all the discussion has been on the oil issue, and I'm going to ask about nuclear power and uranium. First of all, I'd like to know from Senator Carrick whether the government supports the construction of a nuclear power plant in Western Australia and at Portland in Victoria. And secondly, I'd like to know whether the government will strengthen or implement nuclear safeguards agreements. The agreements have been watered down when commercial factors have conflicted with the agreements. The nuclear safeguards policy has gone out the window. We've seen exports. We were about to export to Iran. We do export to South Korea, or we've agreed to. I would like to know whether the government will implement exports. We're going to have our uranium enriched in Finland, the exports to Finland enriched in the Soviet Union. Will the government implement a safeguards policy?
First of all, in Australia, because throughout most of Australia there is coal in abundance at low cost, it is not necessary in the immediate future at all to generate other than from coal. And I know of no project at this moment at all which anticipates other than coal generation. Indeed, coal generation of electricity will be cheaper anyhow, so that I know of no such project at all for Australia. For nuclear safeguards, we have not only followed the Ranger Royal Commission of Inquiry, but we have in fact strengthened our nuclear safeguards so that they're the strongest of the countries in the world. We appointed Mr. Justice Fox as an ambassador at large so that he could contact other countries, so that he could advise us on how to strengthen our safeguards. We are so doing. It's not good, you know, to use the emotive idea that there must be something sinister about sending fuel from Finland to Russia. The suggestion there that the processing might give Russia some extra ability. You know very well as anyone does that Russia is awash with plutonium, that she has a surfeit of nuclear fuel to make all the bombs in the world. That's the tragedy of this world. You equally know that the International Atomic Energy Agency controls by order the movement of all fissile materials throughout the world, both in and out of a country, that it wouldn't benefit Russia one iota to have more uranium. She has an unlimited supply virtually herself. That's an emotional issue that bears no rational response at all in this regard. The fact is, we will strengthen our arrangements regarding nuclear safeguards so that they are and remain the strongest in the world.
Next question is Mr. Patrick Walter from the SMH. I should have mentioned if you could identify yourself and your organisation when you pose the question.
Patrick Walters, Sydney Morning Herald, Mr. Keating. I'd just like to ask you a question on the Ranger operation. Could you just state what your attitude is to Ranger in the light of the ERA float, which closes next week?
I might say it's not a... I'll answer the question, but it's not a question about energy because there's no nuclear power in Australia. That's a minerals question, and the Labor Party's policy is as clear as day, and that is that until certain safeguards have been met, until a Labor cabinet is satisfied that safeguards of nuclear proliferation, that there's an international regime of quality in respect of nuclear non-proliferation and also an acceptable means of waste disposal. Until those two things are in place and satisfactory to a Labor cabinet, it wouldn't agree to export Australian uranium. Or putting in the positive, it would agree to export Australian uranium if those things are in place. Now, that's a matter for a Labor cabinet to make its decision upon. Just to make a couple of extra points on that. At the moment, of course, the nuclear industry is in very bad shape, and there's a surfeit of uranium in the world, and uranium prices are tumbling. A contract which was signed recently between Ranger and some other companies reflects prices which were ruling 5 years ago, and in real terms it's a very dramatically reduced price upon what was not available just some years back. So even if one ignores the environmental criteria and just looks at the commercial criteria, we're selling uranium to happy stockpilers, and while ever we're silly enough to sell, they'll buy.
David Kidd.
David Kidd, Melbourne Herald and Weekly Times, Senator Carrick. I wonder if I could also ask Mr. Keating to comment on this one. Senator Carrick, for some time farm groups have been criticising the government's blind adherence, as they describe it, on basing its import parity pricing on Saudi Arabian light crude. I wondered if the government has taken this criticism on board at all, and if it will give more emphasis to things like world spot prices and world fuel supply and reserves. And I wondered if I asked Mr. Keating how Labor would base its world parity pricing policy.
The government, of course, is aware of the importance to rural industry, to the farming community, of the cost of fuel as it is the cost of everything. The best way to help the farming community is to get all inflation down so that all costs are down, so that it can trade throughout the world as it was falling away before we came into office, so that the battle against total inflation is the best help for the farming community. Equally, what we are doing today is providing fuel in Australia at about half the price that it is being sold in the countries with whom we mainly trade. So the farming community trade with countries where fuel is, as to most of the time, about twice what it is here. Now, the main thing to do to help the farming community and the Australian community is to be sure that there is energy, that there is petrol, that there is oil, lubricating oil, that there are distillates for the future. The real test is what mechanism will ensure that. We believe that import parity pricing, and we're supported by the 20 nations of the International Energy Agency, we're supported by the summit meeting of the Western powers. We believe that it is the fundamental principle to ensure supply for the future. In that belief, wouldn't we be foolish if we didn't act to make sure that we can guarantee for the indefinite future supply to the whole Australian community? Because that's the key. Any short-term fiddle on price is a short-term fiddle, which, you know, if you in fact tend to pretend that price is lower, if you give that pretense, then you use more, you waste more, you dry up your Bass Strait faster, and you have to buy on spot markets. So that it's the sensible thing to do to stick to import parity and get your energy policies in position where they are now.
Well, I'd agree with the general remarks Senator Carrick made about inflation and holding down costs for the rural sector. And just to satisfy the questioner on Saudi Arabian light crude, at the time I think when the government chose Saudi Arabian light, that was virtually the median price of OPEC crudes and the market crude price. That's since widened. If one's got to take a benchmark, one might as well take Saudi Arabian light as anything else. But in respect of the cost of the farming community, there is a very heavy energy inputs to Australian agriculture, and Australian agriculture, particularly in the face of droughts, will pay very dearly for the luxury of the government's import parity pricing policy. Now, I'll just repeat myself for a moment. Both parties support import parity, the concept for new discoveries. You may as well pay a company incorporated in Australia the world price as to pay it to some producer overseas. That's why you save foreign exchange, and those companies, of course, liable for taxation in Australia. So that's common to both of us. But to just pick up a point Senator Carrick made about Bass Strait won't dry up faster. It's drying up at its maximum rate now. That's the point I made earlier. No matter what the government does in terms of price, nothing will save Bass Strait oil. It's going to go at the maximum.
Stuart Simpson.
Stuart Simpson of the Business Review magazine, Senator Carrick. What is the basis of the government's opposition to a resource rental tax? Will you rule out, will you now say that a Fraser government will not introduce such a tax in the life of the next Parliament, given that the Fortescue field is due to come on stream in the next 3 years?
We have made it clear that we believe that the resources tax that the Labour Party proposes to impose will do considerable damage to the oil industry and in particular to the supply of energy for Australia. We believe that the levy that we have now functions to achieve the energy policies, when the resources tax would be exactly the reverse. A resources tax which on Labour's say-so will be imposed upon the oil producers and which on Labour's say-so will yield more than the levy, because the illusion that the levy will disappear and in its place will be nothing in terms of revenue must be dispelled. Labour is not only going to replace the volume of revenue from the levy, but is going to increase it, and its policies need that. Once you put a huge tax on producers who are seeking oil both by exploration and development, then you do what happened during the Whitlam government in 1973, 74, 75. Once companies that are exploring believe that the government is unsympathetic, that the atmosphere is unsympathetic, they haul up and go, and they run out. And investment in Australia fled in those years. If you make it too expensive to explore, then in fact you get 29 wells as you did in 1975 as against 121 today. So that we believe that a resources tax anyway is punitive. It is much easier for people to take up their rigs and go to other countries in the world where opportunities would not be as punitive as a resources tax, therefore exploration would dry up. Why would we want to change when the policies we have in position today are working? We are getting increased exploration all the time. People want to stay here. They want to plough back their profits, as they're doing out of Bass Strait. into more and more development. They want to plough back their profits into the rundles of this world. That's the secret of this situation. So no resource tax on oil. We'll stick to our levy.
Mr. Keating, do you want to reply to that?
I wouldn't mind. It's not true that the Labor Party would impose a resources rent tax and keep the crude oil levy. We would scrap the crude oil levies.
I didn't say that.
I'm sorry, Senator, I understood you said that, so I apologise. The resource tax which the Labor Party would impose would not raise more money. The price determines the level of tax collection rather than the mechanism. A high oil price brings in more revenue. A lower oil price brings in less revenue. The Labor Party would freeze the oil price and forego future revenue coming out of the parity with OPEC. Therefore, it can't collect more revenue than the levy, so a resource tax would collect less. I may also say that we've been honest enough with the industry to tell them that on new oil we will have a resources rent tax, because no government in Australia could live with the prospect of paying an oil producer $30 to $40 a barrel as a cost of production, while it costs them, say, $6 or $8 a barrel to produce the oil, because company tax just doesn't share adequately the windfall. You must have another mechanism. The industry understands they'll have one, and I don't think the industry believes the government would never impose one. I was going to bore you with a quote from Mr. Viner in his passionate defence of the resource tax at the West Coast LNG Symposium on the 16th of December 1977, but I won't bother you with that. He supported a resource tax then and made very cogent reasons then for the imposition of such a tax.
Thank you for another short answer. Bruce Jaddery.
I'll make it a short question, Mr.
Great hope.
Bruce Jaddery, freelancing, Mr. President. This is directed specifically at Senator Carrick, but I'd be interested in Mr. Keating's comments as well. Senator Carrick, you spoke at some length on synthetic fuels and the need to develop them. You spoke of shale, you spoke of coal conversion. You stuck completely to the fossil fuels and their conversion to oil. There are, however, strong possibilities of development of renewable, biologically based fuels. There's the Euphorbia plant, which the CSR has discovered. Okay, I won't go any further. How very little money has been spent by the government, a government which is looking for new fuel sources, on the development of these resources. Could you tell me, do you have any plans for increasing the expenditure on these things, and what would Labor do about it, Mr. Keating?
I have to remind you that in fact I did, when I was talking of synthetics, talk about ethanol, talk about solar, talk about wind power. In fact, I place very great stress upon renewable resources. Now, the fact of the matter is that at this very moment, the CSR and the Shell Company are setting up the first pilot plant regionally at Mackay to make petrol, and ethanol will be added to gasoline so to do. And there are steps underway to regionally in Australia to develop ethanol in a big way. We've set up experimental licenses to farmers, and we are encouraging, by removing the tax off automotive ethanol, the development of ethanol in Australia. We are also encouraging solar energy, although in its present stage, whilst it's very useful to encourage, will not make a synthetic impact, a significant impact. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip. The fact is that ethanol itself is an extender. You can take ethanol, you can make it out of any biomass at all, you can extend fuel by, say, 10%. If you wanted to extend the whole of fuel in Australia by 10%, then you would have to put under agriculture somewhere or other in Australia the equivalent of 300,000 extra hectares of agriculture, assuming you're using sugarcane or beet. Now, it means this, that you've then got to ask yourself, do you compete for food or fuel, or can you use the marginal lands that you're now talking about with the wild rubber plants and so on? An enormous amount of interest is going on in the world in this. I believe that ethanol will grow regionally in Australia. I see it growing certainly in Queensland. It'll extend, I've no doubt, in Tasmania and elsewhere. It will be a valuable extender. So will solar power, so will wind power, but it will not be a full substitute in itself, nor will methanol that we can make from natural gas. we should concentrate upon renewable fuels if we can. My own view is that in 30 years' time, nuclear fusion itself as a technique will be scientifically possible, and we won't be using other sources essentially of the non-renewables. We'll be using the heavy waters, the deuteriums. It's that big bridge of time of 30 years that we need to get over now. By all means, let's encourage renewable resources.
Well, I would generally support what Senator Carrick has said. I agree with most of what he said on this matter. My only caveat would be that I don't think the government spends enough on energy R&D. This year it's $13.6 million out of $4 billion of petrol and energy taxes, and I don't think that's high enough, and I generally don't believe the efforts are coordinated enough. But the general thrust of the policy in that area, I think, is correct. May I just make a point about Rundle while I'm on the feet on alternatives? Both the government and the Labor Party, as I said earlier, support import parity for new discoveries, and Rundle would go under that policy and not the old oil policy, so therefore Rundle could proceed under a Labor government, the same as a Liberal government. It would produce about half of Bass Strait in 1995. Now, environmental considerations included, they would need to be satisfactory given the size of the area that would be dislocated by its activity. I would think it would be very desirable to see 200,000 barrels a day in 1995. It's right at the time when Bass Strait really does expire. So I thought I'd take this opportunity just to support in principle the development of alternatives, particularly shales in Australia. I think the government's on the right track in that. We would be on the same track, running under the same policy.
Bill Pinwell.
Bill Pinwell, freelance. My question is addressed to Senator Carrick in his capacity as Leader of the Government in the Senate, at least at last count. I refer to the unequivocal affirmation made by the Leader of your party, Mr. Fraser, 2 days ago at the Sydney Journalists Club, to the effect that the blocking of supply by the Senate would again be entirely justified in the circumstances of 1975. My question is, do you support that statement?
I take it you're putting this under the caption of renewable energy, are you? Or is it the good oil that you're seeking? Let me say this to you, that neither in any hypothesis at all does it require an answer. The government's going to win in the lower house, therefore there will be no question of difficulty in the Senate. If indeed the government didn't win and there were a Labour majority in the lower house, by the ordinary method of voting, the government wouldn't have a majority in the Senate, so the thing doesn't exist at all. And I wasn't present when I heard either the question or the answer as such, but it has no relevance whatsoever to this campaign, because nothing that can happen in the ballot box gives you any reason to raise such a question in renewable or non-renewable energy.
Thank you. I don't suppose Mr. Keating's got any. Brian Lee.
Brian Lee, freelance and local correspondent for New Scientist. A company called APACE Research has recently found a way of extending dieseline by finding a way of mixing alcohol into it, and also a way of distilling alcohol more cheaply than the usual method of heating it up. They did this without a penny from the government, in spite of putting in grants for it. In fact, Castrol paid, I believe, for that. And Castrol have the rights for these discoveries. And I understand they're about to be applied in Brazil and in the central western states of the United States, and not here. Why is it that the government doesn't support research like this from small companies?
Well, the government has set up a body called NERDEC, and I think no one would doubt both the expertise and the comprehensive nature of that body and the objectivity and scientific quality of the body itself. And NERDEC itself looks at all the applications that come to it. NERDEC examines them very thoroughly, and NERDEC makes recommendations in the light of its own knowledge and the advice to it. And so far, it's not a question of the government making some political judgment in that regard. It's a question of objective and scientific judgment. If anybody knows any kind of activity that they believe nevertheless has opportunities but might be, for whatever reason, not being given a fair go. I have made it perfectly clear within my department and within all the advisory bodies that they're to be brought to me, and I'll get them tested scientifically outside NERDIC if necessary. I'm looking towards some kind of a body that could be an ombudsman in this regard, so that there can be no doubt in this world that even the most way out kind of things are tested. I don't believe at this moment that anything is being obstructed in any sense of bad will. If there is any accidental obstruction, for Lord's sake, let's have it, and we'll have a look at it.
Stuart Simpson.
Stuart Simpson of Business Review, Senator Carrick. Given you have today, seen once and for all ruled out a resource rental tax on the oil producers, how are you going to tax the windfall revenue on the Fortescue field? Or is it, as Mr Keating suggested before, just going to escape with company tax?
Well, we've said we're not going to put a resources tax on oil, and Fortescue is new oil. I make this perfectly clear. I read in the paper that the Labour Party is going to declare Fortescue old oil. I hope I read it correctly, Paul. You can correct me. I want to say this to you, that the determination of whether something is old oil or new oil is not a political government decision at all. It is upon the advice of the Bureau of Mineral Resources. And indeed, that is a body that I think everybody in Australia has learned highly to respect. And that body, by its advice and by my reference back to it and its further advice, has said that Fortescue is new oil. And so that if indeed a Labour Party were to be doing this, it would be making a political judgment and not a scientific judgment, and that ought to be kept clearly in this mind. We will pursue the ordinary profits of companies. If one looks at the profits that SOBHP have made, one will find an interesting thing if you take the profits they've made from 1978 onwards, and I acknowledge your nod in this, that they have ploughed back their profits that they've got in extra ways from higher prices into development and exploration. ESSO itself will be ploughing back profits enormously into Rundle. And if that's a way in which we get development capital for Australia, God bless it, because what Australians need in terms of jobs, in terms of industries, is the assurance that we're going to put into place industries that are going to produce oil, whether natural or synthetic.
Thank you, Senator Keating. Carrick. Mr. Keating wants to reply to that. We've got time for probably two more questions, provided the answers are short and the questions are even shorter.
Thank you, John. In respect of the Fortescue field, a political judgment should never be made on such a matter, and I think it is very important for confidence in the Australian exploration industry that the principle of new oil, once tested, is established, and that companies can believe that we will in fact pay that as a cost of production, and in our case, the Labor Party's case, with a resource rent tax. But what my leader alluded to yesterday was the fact that there is an element of doubt about Fortescue. The revenues are so massive, bearing in mind it costs about $1 a barrel to produce Bass Strait oil, and Fortescue, being a new field, would be a little higher than that, but not all that much. And bearing in mind that the costs which the price the government is now offering is $28 a barrel, and will be much higher when the field comes to development, the revenues are just simply massive. And I don't think SO and BHP for one moment believe that it would escape a levy from a future coalition government or a resource rent tax from the Labor Party. But the issue of whether in fact there is some common geology between Fortescue and the adjoining fields is a matter for geological assessment. At least may we say there is some doubt. That doubt ought to be cleared up by further scrutiny of the issue, and there's no attempt by the Labor Party to disadvantage SO and BHP. They've done this nation at least the service of giving us a very large level of insulation from the vagaries of the international oil market.
We really have very short a time. If we could have one more question from Mungo McCallum, it would be a very short question, a very short answer, and then we go into the 5 minutes summing up.
Right, Mungo McCallum in this stage representing the Sun Herald. Senator Carrick, you pointed out correctly that Australia has ample reserves of coal, that we have no problems about cheap electricity by world standards in this sense. But the real
problem is obviously the shortages of transport fuel for cars, trucks, airlines, etc. Given that, how do you reply to Mr. Keating's criticism that the government's policies are simply not conserving any locally produced transport fuel?
But the government's policies are doing the most vital thing there is as a first up, and that is that they are in the International Energy Agency working together with the other 19 members to lower our consumption of imported fuels so that we produce a glut in the world, so that we slow down OPEC prices rising, as we have done, so that we destroy the spot market, and so that we can bring, however temporarily, to a halt the dangerous situation in the world. And so, in fact, we have been able to drop from something like 280,000 barrels a day to about 240,000 barrels a day. But contrary to what Paul Keating says, we will be, in fact, as over the next year or two, be able to draw not as heavily upon Bass Strait, because the 15% saving in LPG, because the 12% saving in cars, because of the gas pipelines, all those coming together in the immediate years ahead will enable us to lower our consumption on Bass Strait. The vital thing to have done at this moment was to have met OPEC on its own grounds and to have provided a glut, and that has worked.
Thank you, Senator Carrick. That's all the time we have for questions. I now invite our two guests to sum up the debate. First, Mr. Keating, and then Senator Carrick. Mr. Keating.
Well, I'd just like to thank you, John, and thank you very much to the audience for listening attentively. I'd like to make a couple of points. It's terrible to be on the receiving end of a cartel, but good to be in one. And Australia could have a large role to play in the world coal market, and it is foolish indeed if it lets other countries organise its purchasing policies for itself and doesn't follow its own best interests in looking at the lessons of OPEC. And Milton Friedman, who's always preached the fact that cartels can never exist, that ultimately market forces destroy them, has been proved very wrong about OPEC. Now, I was very glad to see that Senator Carrick did accept the thrust of my argument about paying $3 billion of Australian taxpayers' money to the government to conserve Middle East oil. And that's a curious policy for the government to pursue, because as Senator Carrick will have already been advised, the Middle East will be putting a larger and larger proportion of their own oil into the OPEC states. The OPEC states themselves are the largest growth area for OPEC oil, and they're selling their petrol and their petroleum products at between 3 and 7 cents a litre. So we're bleeding ourselves dry, adding 3% to our inflation rate, distorting the whole pattern of receipts of the Commonwealth, making the Commonwealth receipts, 12% of Commonwealth receipts dependent upon a dwindling resource for tax, all in an endeavour to save some of that oil for the OPEC states to gobble up themselves at 3 cents a litre. Well, I can't see the sense of that, and it just proves, I think, the opposition's claim that the government's high petrol price policy is simply a taxation policy and nothing else. As far as the Middle East is concerned, there will be problems in the Middle East, and there are two things Australia must do: lift supplies and look at substitution. We have Australia as a gas-prone continent. There's probably 4 times as much natural gas in Australia as we've ever found. This is not an oil-prone place, and the sensible thing in energy policy is to use your reserves, your things which are available to you, to maximum advantage. The central thrust of Australian energy policy ought to be to maximise our use of natural gas. Now, Labor started this between 1972 and 75. I'm glad the government have identified with the general thrust of that policy, because it's very important for liquid petroleum gas, for motor vehicles, for petrochemicals, and for natural gas, perhaps through the gas to gasoline via the methanol route, could probably give us a very high level of energy independence in the future. Natural gas would be one of the major preoccupations of a Labor government. There is no gas policy in Australia at the moment, and we don't look for gas. We find gas incidental to oil exploration, and we'll be out there looking for gas. So we'd like to lift the level of reserves through a positive approach to exploration, use direct controls such as mandatory fuel consumption standards on motor vehicles to reduce consumption anyway, to save people money, and as well as that, look at substitutes. Now, there are substitutes available. LPG is one. Finally, shales will be another, ethanol another. It's about lifting the level of supplies and looking at substitution, not just relying upon oil exploration, because the Northwest Shelf, the Exmouth Plateau area, seem to be among the most prospective areas in the world. Yes, the BHP and Shell, who have been drilling there with two of the deepest water vessels in the world, have had a very disappointing time of it. They'll soon probably pull out of the program, and where will Australia be? We want some of that energy money poured back into exploration with a government corporation using the money. The alternative is to subsidise large companies like Shell and Esso, and I don't see that as being a viable alternative. And if we could do that, we'd give Australia a level of energy independence in liquid fuels which would be the envy of the world. We don't have to worry about electricity. We have a lot of coal, and we'd have an abundance of natural gas for our industrial and commercial and household uses and heating. What we must concentrate on is liquid fuels. A Labor government would very quickly organise a national energy policy. We'd establish the right instruments. We'd reduce the price of petrol in the sense that we wouldn't be charging what the government would be charging Australians next year under its policy. Australians will have the benefit of an oil field in their own country, and they'll have a level of energy independence in liquid fuels, the envy of the Western world.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. I now invite Senator Carrick to sum up for the government.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've said that any energy policy must ensure supply, that in so doing it must do four things. It must conserve, it must convert, it must explore, it must produce synthetics. And I hope by showing you what has happened in conservation, what has happened in conversion, what is happening in exploration and in synthetics, I've put together for you a constructive, integrated, orchestrated policy that is working. Now I want to look at the alternative on this situation and look at the Labour Party's policies. A party that says, look, you can lower the prices to the Australian people, is saying to the Australian people, you can use more petrol. If you use more petrol, whether you use it from Bass Strait or from abroad, you are wasting a precious resource. You are forcing higher prices because you must get it onto higher spot prices. As such, because you will run out. You are discouraging conversion away from oil because you're saying that the price can be lower, and therefore the stimulus to convert is not there, so you're not moving on to those kind of things. I don't have to demonstrate the ball game of exploration because it was there from 1975 onwards, and only 29 wells then, 121 now. So I don't have to demonstrate what the fact that the Labour Party in the past has repelled such things. I don't have to demonstrate because the stock exchange today and yesterday has indicated what in fact the investment public, the ordinary people of Australia, think of a Labour government in terms of investment of capital. So there it is quite clearly as a poll of the people yesterday and today, in that the synthetic fuel people have said one thing very, very clearly indeed. They've said that unless they can be guaranteed import parity pricing, not import parity pricing for new oil and something else for old oil, but import parity pricing, they will not come into the business at all. That poll today has been quite silent on this story of petrol pricing of the Labour, except by casual mention at the beginning, and I want to have a look at it for you, because for months and months we were told that really the Labour Party was going to lower the price of petrol. Well, it was given us an option, one of the three options, to drop it by 3 cents. Didn't I hear that said? I thought I had, and perhaps some others did. Yes, so they were going to lower the price of petrol. That's off. Then they were going to freeze the price of petrol. Leaflet after leaflet all over the electorate says it. But that's not true at all. What are they going to turn out to do? They're going to freeze for 1 year the price of indigenous oil in Australia. Not the 33% of oil that comes in, that can run at a price, not that, but only the indigenous oil. So that in fact, and then they say something which is arrant nonsense. They say that Australia gets 90% of its gasoline from its indigenous oil. That is simply not true. It is only 75%. If they attempt to get 90%, what they will do in the effect of the fractions of the distillates, both in volume and price, what they will do with fuel oil and lubricants will be disastrous in a country that needs more distillates and needs less gasoline. And that's the trend at this moment, but they don't say that. They create the illusion on this. And so they would force up the price of distillate in a country that needs to keep it down at this moment. Well, they're the facts as they are. Now let's take the CPI, and let's look at the CPI, because I did a few sums, and I said, let's see what the CPI was running at in the last year that Paul Keating was a minister, 17.6% and rising. Right, not for long though, no, that's perfectly true. That again was a Freudian slip, because it would have been 18, 19, 20%. And what is the price of OPEC petrol in Australia going to rise this whole year? 18%. What's in it for you? So right, then you've got, of course, his admission that in any case we believe in import parity for new oil, so when old oil runs out, you'll be on new oil anyhow on import parity. Where then is the policy except in ruins? In the whole of this campaign, the whole thrust has been, let's talk price in a fiddle. And so the price fiddle has been on. No mention of the fact that the world outside was falling to bits and that we needed a supply situation. And then when we take the price situation, we find they're not going to lower it, they're not going to freeze it, it's a fiddle, and there's nothing in the CPI, and there's nothing in the import parity thing. What you've got is a hoax. I've said that before, I regret it. I wish that this debate over recent weeks had been on a more orderly fashion on how Australia could have got supply.
Today's National Press Club luncheon guests were Senator John Carrick and Mr. Paul Keating, who were introduced by the President of the National Press Club, Mr. John Lombard. That's all from Kevin Chapman in Canberra.